Sometimes when we think about our favorite horror gaming franchises, we tend to go back to the start of the series. What horror game started it all? However, when it comes to horror games and even video games in general, usually the first entry is far from the best of the series. And a lot of the time, the second installment of our favorite horror franchises usually ups the ante in just about every single way. Better visuals, better storytelling, scarier moments, better soundtrack, better gameplay, the list goes on. So on this episode of Nerd Space Games, we're taking a look at the best sequels in horror games. For the record, I'm only focusing on the second mainline entry of a horror franchise. And in most cases, the ranking will be based on how much better the said sequel is compared to the original game. Make sense? Finally, we won't be focusing on the remakes of the series, but instead the originals and their respective sequels. For example, when comparing RE1 and RE2, we're looking at both the 1996 version of the original Nightmare and the 1998 version of RE2, not the remakes that followed. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 10 best horror game sequels of all time. Let's get it. Number 10, Outlast 2. In 2013, one of the scariest games ever created was introduced to gamers. Enter Outlast. The game will put you into the shoes of a reporter as he explored the Mount Massive Asylum while unraveling the mystery within the walls of this fucked up place. 4 years later, we were treated to Outlast 2. Now I'll start off by saying that Outlast 2 is better in just about every single way with the exception of one element. The original game is definitely scarier in my opinion. With that being said, everything else had been improved in the much anticipated sequel. Instead of being contained in a single building, Outlast 2 throws you into the wilderness of northern Arizona in which you'll come across villages filled with cult members, mines filled with cannibals, and open wastelands filled with deformed creatures around each corner. Outlast 2 still uses a lot of the same mechanics seen in the first game, but improves the gameplay side of things by making it easier and smoother to outrun your opponents by jumping through windows and locking latches on doors. Add that to the much more interesting story of Outlast 2 that sees Blake, the main character, attempting to save his wife as the apocalypse slowly approaches. The game dives much more into storytelling than its predecessor, and it's a lot easier to follow compared to the original game where most of the key details of the story are hidden in files. The chase sequences are longer, bigger, and better, and the flashback sequences in the school are some of the most terrifying moments of video games. Number 9, System Shock 2. Shodan is easily one of the most iconic villains in horror games, and it definitely plays a part in why people enjoy the System Shock games so much. However, when comparing System Shock to its sequel, most would argue that the second entry was better in just about every single way. For one, the plot of the second game is much more interesting than the first. The whole idea of the alien race that you, as the player in the first game, sent off into space crash landed on a planet and then decades later, people found these aliens again only to be turned into mutants was an excellent premise to the start of the game. From here, the gameplay is what really sets the sequel apart though. Unlike the first game, System Shock 2 created a perfect mix between survival horror and RPG. Two traits that were barely seen in the first installment of the series. Having the ability to manage your character and build up your resources based on your own unique playstyle made System Shock 2 one of the most unique survival horror experiences to this day, even 25 years later. In fact, these mechanics explored in the second installment were so groundbreaking that the remake of System Shock included some features from the second game in order to enhance the experience of the System Shock remake. Overall, System Shock 2 is regarded as one of the best sci-fi horror games ever created, and fans are extremely hyped for the possibility of a System Shock 2 remake sometime in the near future. Number 8, Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead and its sequel are still regarded as some of the best asymmetrical horror games of all time. The idea of pitting human players against infected players during some of the iconic campaigns of both games created some of the most entertaining moments of gaming. And while the first game set the tone for its darker and scarier settings, it was the sequel, Left 4 Dead 2, that improved every element of the gameplay to create the best asymmetrical horror game of all time. In the first game, you had unique special infected like hunters and smokers, but in the sequel, we were introduced to twice as many special infected. In Left 4 Dead 2, the players on the infected side could control all of the special infected from the original game, but also creatures like the Jockey, a short and quick infected that could control a human player and force them off the side of a building or directly into a horde. Or they could control a Spitter, a special infected that could spit acid at the survivors, dealing damage to them over time. However, this sequel also added new resources for the survivors as well. New melee weapons like a chainsaw and even more guns were introduced to the sequel to create more alternatives for dealing with the infected. The maps in the second entry were also a lot more diverse and different from each other. Not to mention that the cast in Left 4 Dead 2 were a little more interesting as well. Add that to the fact that the second installment also eventually added the campaigns from the first game, then it's no wonder why Left 4 Dead 2 is viewed as the better of the two games and the best asymmetrical horror game of all time. Number 7, Dead Space 2. When comparing the original Dead Space, not the remake, to its sequel, Dead Space 2 definitely has a beat. While the original game was a masterpiece and the setting of the Ishimura was perfect for a sci-fi horror game, the fact is that the same could be said about Dead Space 2. Actually, I would argue that everything good about the first game of the franchise is done better in the sequel. For one, Isaac can talk. Listen, I know that might not seem like a big deciding factor for me, but when comparing the original game to its 2023 remake, adding in dialogue for Isaac just makes it a better experience overall. And it allows us to connect more with his emotions and understand his feelings throughout the events of the game. So not having that in the first game wasn't something that I thought I needed until I played the second game and the remake of the first game. But that's only a small reason as to why I prefer Dead Space 2. I know there might be a lot of people out there that might disagree with me, but I thought the space station in the second game was a much better setting than the Ishimura in the first game. Don't get me wrong, exploring that ship was terrifying, but it also felt extremely repetitive. Every room felt vastly similar to each other on the Ishimura due to the darkness of the game and it being set on a single spaceship throughout most of the game. In the sequel, however, you're exploring a massive space station. Different locations are more unique to each other and it feels like you're getting a different tone from different areas within this station. For example, one of the most terrifying areas and personally my favorite location in the second game is Titan Elementary. Those exploding kid-like aliens were awful. Speaking of which, I felt like most of the second game was scarier than the first game. Hell, even comparing the opening sequence of each game demonstrates how much more intense and scarier the second installment is compared to the first game. Overall, I find Dead Space 2 scarier, better, and more interesting as a whole when comparing it to the original game. Now, bringing the remake into the discussion is a whole other story for a different video. Number 6, Parasite Eve 2. A lot of Parasite Eve fans would argue that the first entry is the best of the franchise, but honestly, I would have to disagree with the majority there. I love Parasite Eve 2. Actually, the only thing that I would argue that the first game does better than the second game would be the story. I definitely find the story of the first game more interesting, but everything else about the second installment is superior. Well, at least from a horror game standpoint. Probably the biggest difference between the two games is the gameplay. The first game feels more like a traditional Square Enix game as it uses traditional RPG mechanics during combat. You'll need to wait your turn while running and avoiding attacks until your meter fills up. Once it does, you can choose to use an ability or attack the enemies. However, in Parasite Eve 2, the gameplay mechanics changed completely. It plays more like a survival horror game, but with its own RPG flair to it. You'll still need to run around the battlefield to dodge attacks, but you can also attack whenever you see openings by using your abilities or weapons without having to wait for a meter to fill up. Also, Parasite Eve 2 definitely uses a lot more puzzles than its predecessor. Actually, Parasite Eve 2 has some of the most difficult puzzles seen in survival horror games, which is another reason why I like it so much more than the original game. Another major difference in Parasite Eve 2 is branching narratives. Similar to other survival horror games of its time, Parasite Eve 2 has multiple different endings in which most of the side characters of the game can either die or live based on decisions made throughout the game. Basically, the Parasite Eve games have always been a mix of survival horror and RPG elements. However, the first two games lean more one way or the other. The first game is definitely the better RPG experience with a traditional leveling system and combat system, whereas the second game definitely leans heavily into survival horror elements. Hey, perhaps that's a big reason why I enjoy the second game a lot more than the first. Number 5, The Evil Within 2. Parasite Eve 2 might be my most controversial pick on today's list, but can also see a lot of people disagree with me preferring Evil Within 2 over the original game. However, like many other entries on today's list, Evil Within 2 actually improves on the original game in multiple different ways. For one, Evil Within 2 has a much more expansive world. I know some people are not a massive fan of open world horror games, but I've always been on the side of them as long as they are done right. More specifically, I think semi-open worlds in survival horror games fit better than giant open worlds. And I feel like Evil Within 2 was one of the games that I felt like handled the semi-open world setting in a survival horror game pretty well. While the second entry was linear, the original game was even more straightforward. No side quests, no areas to explore, pretty much it's a straight and narrow path. In the sequel, you can find pretty cool areas and even an optional boss encounter in the game by exploring these semi-open world segments of the game. Anima, without a doubt the scariest and most unpredictable parts of Evil Within 2, can only be encountered if the player explores Union to its fullest. On top of the semi-open world, Evil Within also does a better job with storytelling. Combat in the game is definitely smoother as well, and the boss fights of Evil Within 2 are some of the most creative and exciting boss fights of all survival horror games. It's a damn tragedy that Tango Gameworks was shut down, because after seeing the direction that the Evil Within series was heading, we could have seen one of the best horror game trilogies of all time if we got that third installment of the franchise one day. Number 4, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. The Fatal Frame series is one of the scariest survival horror franchises out there due to the game forcing the player to face ghosts head on with nothing but a camera. Unlike most survival horror games, you can't just unload your bullets into them. No, you have to be patient and calm as you locate the ghosts, look them in the face, and take a picture of them at the right time. The first game was definitely scary for this and included some of the creepiest and most difficult ghosts of the series. However, that original game is child's play compared to its sequel, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. Starting with the gameplay, Crimson Butterfly was vastly superior to the original game. In the first Fatal Frame, fighting ghosts was extremely difficult thanks to the controls of that game. Moving the camera around was extremely clunky, and trying to aim at the upcoming ghosts, especially the faster ones, was the biggest obstacle of that first game. However, Crimson Butterfly improved on the mechanics of using the camera against ghosts drastically. The camera was much easier to control, the aim assist made it easier to locate the ghosts, and the number of different abilities that could be attached to your camera in the upgrade system of Fatal Frame 2 was much better than the original game. Looking at the main enemies of both games, the ghosts, Fatal Frame 2 was better in that department as well. While the first game definitely had some terrifying moments and some creepy ghosts, Fatal Frame 2 definitely had it beat. The bent neck woman was terrifying to deal with. The falling woman was one of the more iconic fights against a ghost with the unique mechanic of her falling to her death after each Fatal Frame shot. And probably the biggest improvement was the main enemy of the game, Sai. Kiri in the first game was definitely terrifying, and every time she popped up and chased me, I was definitely scared out of my mind. However, she had nothing on Sai. I still have nightmares thinking about the hide and seek section of Crimson Butterfly, in which you lose your camera and you have to avoid Sai as you make your way back to it. And when you add these elements to one of the best stories ever in a horror game, then you have a true masterpiece in Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. Number 3, Resident Evil 2. It kills me not to put Resident Evil 2 as my number 1 entry on today's list, but I'm trying my best to remain as unbiased as possible. Listen, RE2 is without a doubt my favorite video game of all time. With that being said, this list is about the best horror game sequel when comparing it to the first game of the series. And for that reason, I feel like there are 2 other games above this one that feel like a much better experience compared to the original games of their respective series. Still, from the original nightmare of RE1 to the masterpiece that is Resident Evil 2, obviously there is a significant improvement, and for that reason, we find RE2 claiming the number 3 spot on today's list. When looking at the original game, it's clear that it was a masterpiece in its own right. Hell, this game inspired so many other survival horror games that came after it. Even the next 2 entries on today's list that we'll talk about soon took inspiration from this franchise. With that being said, Resident Evil 2 took everything that worked in the original game and built on that foundation to create one of, if not the best survival horror experience of all time. Firstly, while both games featured 2 playable protagonists, Resident Evil 2 found a way to create more replayability with the game by introducing 2 unique mechanics, the zapping system and the AB scenario. While the game already created unique storytelling in each character's campaign, with the support character being either Ada or Sherry depending on who you are playing as, the A and B scenario system added even more replayability to the game. Now, not only will you have unique interactions with certain characters based on who you are playing as, but you'll also have unique and new scenes based on which order you played the campaigns in. This motivated the player to play Resident Evil 2 at least 4 separate times to fully experience the entire game. The zapping system added to that a little more by allowing certain elements of Scenario A to carry over to Scenario B based on decisions made in Scenario A. Add that to the more interesting boss encounters of this game in the form of Mr. X and William Birkin, the iconic setting of the RPD station, and one of the best soundtracks of the franchise, then it shouldn't be too surprising to find Resident Evil 2 breaking the top 3 best horror games sequels of all time. Number 2, Alan Wake 2. The original Alan Wake 2 was a cult classic and one that hardcore fans supported all of these years later by praying and hoping for a sequel one day. However, if you were to replay that original game nowadays, you'll probably realize that it definitely didn't age that well and it's nowhere near as good as you remembered. Sure, there were some pretty cool mechanics and visuals with the darkness and the flashlight, plus the story was interesting enough, but overall it was a subpar horror game at best. With that being said, 13 years later, we got one of the best follow-ups to a horror game in the form of Alan Wake 2. Without a doubt, Alan Wake 2 is in my top 5 horror games of all time. Alan Wake 2 took everything that was introduced in the original game, removed the worst parts of it, added inspiration from other modern survival horror games, and created a unique story for one hell of an experience. Like the original game, Alan Wake 2 still chose to have the darkness as the main antagonist. Essentially, it's a supernatural force that turns works of art into reality, but does so in a way that benefits the darkness. In order to escape the darkness and defeat it once and for all, Alan Wake writes Saga Anderson, an FBI agent, into his story to help fight against the darkness. The two use their own unique abilities to fight the darkness and the people possessed by it, solve mysteries within Bright Falls and the Dark Place, and ultimately save everybody in Bright Falls and even the world essentially. The gameplay of Alan Wake 2 takes a lot of inspiration from other modern survival horror games like Resident Evil 2 Remake. Actually, Sam Lake and Remedy Entertainment's decision to use games like RE2 Remake as the main inspiration for the combat of Alan Wake 2 may have been one of the best decisions made by the studio. It allowed the game to feel like a true modern survival horror game, but with its own flair thanks to some of its own unique mechanics and storytelling. Alan Wake 2 also introduced a semi-open world for the player to explore as both Alan Wake and Saga. As Saga Anderson, you could explore Bright Falls and the areas around it. As Alan Wake, you could use your writing skills to open new areas within the Dark Place that was essentially a fictional recreation of New York City. The soundtrack was also iconic, and honestly, it's up there as one of my favorite soundtracks in video games. I mean, Herald of Darkness is still stuck in my head almost a full year later. I can go on and on about how Alan Wake 2 improved not only on the original game, but on modern survival horror games as a whole. However, I'll leave it at this. I know there are a lot of haters out there for this game, and I totally respect that. This game is not for everybody. With that being said, if you haven't played it, then I highly recommend that you play for yourself and decide for yourself how good this game actually is. And perhaps you'll enjoy it. I know I did. Number 1, Silent Hill 2. If I was to tell you my personal favorite second installment of a horror game franchise, then it would probably be Resident Evil 2. However, if you were to ask me what the best horror game sequel of all time is, then I can't see myself hesitating at all when I say Silent Hill 2. Looking at the full package, it's clear that Silent Hill 2 is the best horror game sequel of all time. I mean, let's compare it to the original game. While both games are fantastic and I'm a massive fan of that first Silent Hill game, I can't help but notice that Silent Hill 2 has a beat in just about every single way. Sure, Silent Hill 1 had an extremely captivating story with Alessa and the monsters of the town being created from Alessa's nightmares. However, Silent Hill 2 goes one step farther with the storytelling. Spoilers for Silent Hill 2 if you haven't played it yet, but this game instead plays on the main character's fears, regrets, and even desires. For example, Maria is created based off of the image that James wishes Mary was. Pyramid Head is essentially the executioner of James's guilt and was manifested by James himself in order to punish him for what he did. What's even more unique with Silent Hill 2 is that each character in the game sees their own personal hell. For example, a boss fight in Silent Hill 2, Abstract Daddy, is essentially the manifestation of Angela's trauma. However, we only see it from James's perspective. What Angela sees is more than likely much worse than what we actually fight against. This unique storytelling that is present throughout the entire game makes Silent Hill 2 one of the best stories seen in all video games, not just horror games. However, the game continues to improve on the original. Obviously, the visuals are better due to the upgrade from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2, but the atmosphere itself is better overall. While the atmospheric horror of Silent Hill's Ocamillo Hospital and Midwich Elementary are top-notch, they still pale in comparison to Brookhaven Hospital and Toluca Prison. Of course, the combat is improved slightly as well, but another big improvement comes from the side characters. While Lisa Garland and Michael Kaufman were iconic in their own right, exploring the deeper and darker paths of Silent Hill 2's characters like Angela and Eddie kept things mysterious throughout the events of the second game. Finally, the boss fights were incredible, and Pyramid Head is still without a doubt one of the most iconic enemies in horror games. So for all of these reasons and more, I consider Silent Hill 2 the best horror game sequel of all time. Well, that's it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Silent Hill 2 the best horror game sequel of all time, or do you think another game deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. And don't forget to leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyways, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.